Hey everybody, Marcus here. It is no mystery that there has been a subtle tension between the anti-feminist community and MGTOW. It is not uncommon for those within the anti-feminist community to label MGTOW as the male equivalent of feminism. Though there have been instances where MGTOW have gone after anti-feminists, historically, the nature of such attacks tended to focus on an individual anti-feminist and not on the core project of anti-feminism itself. However, this has not held similarly true when attacks have come from the anti-feminist community directed at MGTOW. It is far more common for anti-feminists to attack the MGTOW project as a whole, as opposed to individual MGTOW, though the latter does happen from time to time. Up to this point, it is not known to me of any MGTOW content creators who have gone after the core anti-feminist project directly. Such activities tend to be the sole domain of feminists themselves. For the most part, anti-feminism is not perceived as being in direct conflict with any MGTOW position. It has not been seen by the MGTOW community that if the anti-feminist project succeeds, that this will yield a negative result on men. In fact, when taken from a MGTOW perspective, some MGTOW would consider feminism the greater evil as opposed to traditionalism. Under such an interpretation, the eradication of feminism and the reinstatement of traditionalism would be a step up, but not a solution in itself. Now, in this video, I want to explore the anti-feminist project directly. More specifically, I want to see how anti-feminist this project actually is. Let us first look at the term at face value. To be an anti-feminist, one must be in opposition to something. In this case, feminism. However, here we must look a little closer at the word anti. The word itself sometimes carries a sense in which the nature of the opposition carries with it support for the opposite thing for which one is anti. For example, if I am anti-abortion, it would necessarily be the case that I was pro-life, as those two positions are exhaustive for the issue at hand. However, this not need be the case for anti-feminists. For example, if I was anti-Islam, there would be no specific opposite towards which I was logically committed to. It does not logically follow, in addition to this, that to be anti-Islam entails pro-Christianity. It also does not follow that to be anti-Islam is to be pro-atheism. So, much like in our anti-Islam example, feminism does not have some logical opposite towards which one is necessarily committed to by being an anti-feminist. Anti-feminism does not itself carry some pro-something entailment. However, if this is the case, then what must the anti-feminist be saying when he so describes himself as an anti-feminist? Well, he must be saying that feminism is either morally wrong or ontologically false. In other words, it is either the case that feminism is somehow evil and therefore ought to be opposed on ethical grounds, or that feminism rests on false premises and those premises ought to be rejected as they do not obtain in reality. So, is being an anti-feminist similar to being anti-abortion? In the sense that the pro-life side views abortion as morally wrong? Or is anti-feminism more like being anti-theist, in the sense that one denies the ontological obtainment of God? Perhaps to answer this question, we need to look towards how prominent anti-feminists describe feminism. Sargon of Akkad, over the course of his time as an anti-feminist, has described feminism as a religion. Religious symbolism has been used by many within the anti-feminist community to describe feminists as well as feminist institutions and practices. If we take the lead of these anti-feminists in terms of what they say, then it would follow that to be an anti-feminist is more similar to being anti-theist than it is to being anti-abortion. If this is true, then it would follow that feminism is opposed not on the grounds that it is ethically wrong, but on the grounds that feminist claims do not ontologically obtain. In other words, anti-feminists must believe that feminists make ontological claims which are false, and that those claims ought to be rejected, as well as all conclusions that follow from arguments that use those claims as their premises. I believe this is a fair assessment of the anti-feminist project. Other supporting evidence of this can be found in the sort of activities that anti-feminists engage in. Activities such as refutations of the wage gap, rape culture, and other ontological claims that feminists make. Now, Anti-feminists are quite adamant on making a certain distinction in their discourse. They stress very strongly that there's a difference between women and feminism. Whenever an anti-feminist is accused by a feminist of being anti-woman, the anti-feminist will reach towards this distinction. The anti-feminist will state that women are people and feminism is an ideology. Furthermore, the anti-feminist will state that he or she is against the ideology and not against the people who may have succumbed to it. So far, so good. Now, this strategy of separating ideology from people has been used by the anti-SJW community at large to separate Muslims from Islam as well. Sargon of Akkad has done this in a few of his videos, and I am sure others in his community have done the same. Let us explore this. What would it take to defeat Islam as an ideology? Surely you cannot point to terrorists and say that Islam is false because there are adherents of Islam who choose to strap bombs to themselves and blow things up. After all, if it is true that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad was his prophet, the Quran the word of God, and the Quran commands martyrdom, then a Muslim who engages in suicide bombing is necessarily an ethical exemplar of what one ought to be. In other words, if Islam is true, then all that follows from Islam is necessarily true and just, including suicide bombing, if that indeed is the correct interpretation of Islam. Indeed, you cannot judge whether or not Islam is true based on whether or not you approve of what any adherent of Islam does or does not do. What you can do, however, is judge whether or not what any given Muslim does is correct and just by referring to the Islamic works. In this way, you can use Islam to query whether or not a Muslim is behaving appropriately according to the faith, but you cannot use the behavior of Muslims to query whether or not Islam itself is true. Indeed, to defeat Islam, namely what anti-SJWs refer to as the ideology of Islam, one must completely ignore the actions of all Muslims, as their actions are irrelevant to the truth of Islam. It is logically fallacious to attempt to prove Islam false based on any action any Muslim might take in the name of Islam. To defeat Islam, one would need to demonstrate one of the following things. You could try to prove that Muhammad never existed, or you could try to prove that the Quran is not the word of God, or that God does not exist, or, and what is the typical Christian strategy, that the Islamic conception of God is not God at all. However, you cannot prove Islam false by pointing to suicide bombers or anything else you do not like that has been done by a Muslim. Let us remember, the anti-SJW community has very clearly created a division between the ideology of Islam and the Muslim himself. The anti-SJW is not against the Muslim, but against the ideology. Now, it must be the case that the anti-SJW is trying to demonstrate Islam to be false. Because if he is merely trying to demonstrate that Islam is not compatible with Western culture, he is opening himself up to a much bigger problem. You see, if Islam is true, and Islam is not compatible with Western culture, then it follows that Western culture ought to be destroyed, as it is incompatible with the will of God. Now, I doubt any anti-SJW could rationally conclude that if Islam is true, and Islam is incompatible with Western culture, that Western culture ought to be preserved in direct defiance to the will of God. Anyways, our discussion of Islam is meant to provide the framework under which we must imagine the anti-feminist project to rest in. As the anti-feminist has distinguished between feminism as an ideology and feminists as practitioners of feminism, then we are faced with the same situation as when we look at Islam. First, we must note that we cannot defeat feminism as an ideology, which is the stated object of opposition by the anti-feminist, by looking at any actions whatsoever taken by any actual feminists. In the same way that Islam cannot be found to be false by pointing to the existence of suicide bombers, so too can feminism not be demonstrated to be false by pointing to man-hating laws, or feminist violence, or the seemingly never-ending parade of stupid shit that feminists do. Indeed, to demonstrate the ideology of feminism to be false, we must look elsewhere. We must look towards those beliefs which, if demonstrated to be false, would render feminism to be false. Now, as anti-feminists analogize feminism as a religion, let us continue our investigation in this spirit. Every religion has one core belief upon which everything else rests. In Islam, it is the belief that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad was his prophet. If this is shown to be false, Islam is immediately refuted. In Christianity, the belief is that Jesus Christ was the Son of God who died on the cross and was resurrected. If you can refute the existence of Jesus, his death, or his resurrection, so too you would immediately prove Christianity to be false. But what about feminism? What is that core belief that if refuted, feminism is also immediately proven to be false? Well, why don't we turn to the document Karen Strong has often used as the first visible starting point of feminist political action, namely, the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls in 1848. Though there are several grievances issued by women towards men in that document, they all hold their justification in this singular sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. And from this short extract from the Declaration of Sentiments, if the assertion that all men and women are created equal were refuted, this would fully and immediately prove feminism false. All feminist ideology stems from the core belief that women are equal to men. The entirety of the feminist project rests on this proposition being true. It is impossible to deem this proposition false and be able to construct a coherent accounting of the last 150 years of feminist activity. The Declaration of Sentiments ought to be considered the canonical treatise in defense of patriarchy theory. Only a little later in the document do we encounter the following sentence. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. What follows are 16 grievances cited as evidence in justifying this sentence. However, these grievances can only be defended if and only if the proposition that men are equal to women holds true. So, the question before us becomes this. Do anti-feminists attempt to demonstrate that the core assertion that underpins feminism from its very inception, namely, the premise that women are equal to men, is false? The answer is no. There is no anti-feminist that I am aware of that attempts to demonstrate that the assertion that women are equal to men is false. Only MGTOW offers such a refutation. But if it is the case that anti-feminists do not attempt to refute this core premise, then it follows that anti-feminists accept the fundamental belief upon which all of feminism rests. In addition to this, by accepting this core feminist belief, they are also logically bound to assert as true all logical consequences that follow from this belief. However, let us proceed in our argument slowly. Anti-feminists, including Milo Yiannopoulos, have repeatedly stated that one can accept the assertion that women are equal to men without adopting the label of feminist. Milo has defended the thesis that one can both support equality between the sexes and not be a feminist. Let us grant this assertion to the anti-feminist. However, let us return to our religious analogy to clarify what this sounds like. Earlier, we said that the core belief of Christianity is that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, died on the cross, and was resurrected. Now, let us suppose that I assert that indeed, Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that he died on the cross, and was resurrected. Can I hold this belief to be true without adopting the label of Christian? Well, I suppose I could. I suppose I could call myself a Catholic, a Protestant, a Lutheran, a Presbyterian, an Evangelical, a Baptist, or even a Calvinist. Each of these labels entails theological differences. Some of the theological differences, in fact, are quite radical, such as the differences between Catholics and Protestants. Indeed, each of these labels can also lead to radically different behaviors, such as can be seen between Catholic monastic monks and the Bible thumpers of the Westboro Baptist Church. Yet no matter the spectrum of behaviors that can be observed as a result of identifying with any of these labels, or the seeming monumental theological differences between the groups, I don't think anyone is delusional about what the common denominator is. They are all ultimately Christian. In the same way, if an anti-feminist is not outright rejecting the assertion that women are equal to men, then the anti-feminist still finds him or herself in the same family of beliefs as the feminist does. Let us take another example to further illustrate this point. If I were to assert as true the propositions put forward by National Socialism, as well as give assent to the normative claim that Jews ought to be gassed, it would be safe to say someone would be justified in labeling me a Nazi. However, I could easily retort that the historical entity referred to as the Nazi Party does not own the concepts of National Socialism or the concept of gassing Jews. In this way, like the anti-feminist seems to do, I could dismiss the label canonically attributed as a short form for a particular set of beliefs and just call myself the Happy Puppy Party. After all, the Happy Puppy Party is not composed of Nazis, even though all of our ontological and normative claims are identical to those of the Nazis. In fact, an overwhelming number of anti-feminists hold to be true a majority of traditionally feminist views. Let us go through a list of feminist beliefs which I have not heard any prominent anti-feminist reject. 1. Women ought to have the right to vote. 2. Women ought to receive paid maternity leave. 3. Men ought not to automatically be heads of the household. 4. Women ought to be able to work in any job they choose. 5. Housewives ought to receive at least half of all family assets upon divorce. 6. Marital rape is real. 7. Women are just as intelligent as men. 8. Women are just as capable as men in performing the same roles. 9. Women are just as effective leaders as men. Many other feminist views could be injected into this list. However, there is no need to enumerate them all to illustrate the point. The number of normative and ontological claims originally defended by feminists, held in common by both feminists and anti-feminists, is not trivially small. This should not be seen as a surprise, as these assertions tend to flow naturally from the core belief that women are equal to men. Indeed, many anti-feminists pride themselves on their position of equality. Many consider themselves egalitarian, or use some other label that similarly anchors itself in the equality of all people. However, let us explore the egalitarian position for a moment as it pertains to the notion of equality. If indeed the egalitarian believes that all people are equal in some unqualified manner, then it follows that the egalitarian believes that women are equal to men. If this is true, and the core feminist belief is that women are equal to men, then it follows that egalitarianism entails feminism, or more specifically, the core ideology of feminism. In this way, the egalitarian may be perceived as a superset of beliefs on equality that the feminist may not hold. For example, though the core belief of feminism may be that women are equal to men, it need not follow that a feminist believes blacks are equal to whites. Though the belief that blacks are equal to whites has been subsequently held by feminists, it is not a necessary or core belief, as the early feminist suffrage movement did not advocate for the rights to vote for blacks. But if the anti-feminist still holds the core belief of feminism, then how could he possibly be an anti-feminist? Well, the answer is that he cannot, in the sense he believes he is. Earlier, we said that the anti-feminist makes the clear separation between the ideology of feminism and the practitioner of feminism. We have also established that the anti-feminist claims to be against the ideology of feminism. However, we have clearly demonstrated that the anti-feminist readily accepts the core belief of feminist ideology. So, if an anti-feminist is to be anti-feminist, he must redefine the ideology of feminism in a manner that excludes those beliefs that follow from the assertion that women are equal to men, and includes assertions he does not believe in. Indeed, this is the very thing the anti-feminist does. When you listen to discourse from prominent anti-feminist speakers, they will typically adhere to the segmentation of feminism in terms of waves. Namely, they support the assertions that first and second wave feminists made, but reject what they classify as third wave feminism. However, to give assent to what first and second wave feminism put into place is to give assent to feminism. This is logically consistent with the anti-feminist defense of the assertion that women are equal to men, and once again reinforces that that assertion is indeed the core ideological assertion of feminism. It seems that if a third wave feminism never occurred, neither would the anti-feminist come into being. After all, through his own confession, the anti-feminist asserts as true all beliefs feminism has proliferated leading up to and including the conclusion of the second wave. Indeed, it seems that when the anti-feminist speaks of dividing the feminist ideology from the practitioners of feminism, he must also divide the ideology of feminism leading up to the third wave with the ideology he perceives to be in play in third wave feminism. This division of feminist ideology can be inferred both overtly and implicitly in much of anti-feminist rhetoric. third-wave feminism is asserted as a supremacy movement, whereas the first two waves are asserted as equality movements. With this ideological rebranding of feminism, the anti-feminist can resolve the logical conflict of supporting the core belief presented in the Declaration of Sentiments leading up to the third wave, while still retaining an anti-feminist stance. Let us grant the anti-feminist this division. Indeed, let us suppose that third-wave feminist ideology is rooted in the belief that women are better than men, and not in the belief that women are equal to men. In this way, the anti-feminist is able to be opposed to feminist ideology, and indeed work towards proving the core third-wave premise to be false. However, let us explore the consequences of this move on the part of the anti-feminist. Where does that position such a person insofar as their beliefs are concerned? Well, let us ask ourselves a different question. Let us suppose I am a Christian. If this is true, then I hold the core belief that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that he died on the cross and was resurrected. Now, let us suppose that 100 years go by, and that core Christian belief is changed. Let us suppose that now, those calling themselves Christian believe that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad was his prophet. Can changing that which makes a thing, that thing, still retain its meaning? If the Christian core belief is now that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad was his prophet, then what do you call someone who believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, was crucified and resurrected? Clearly, the word Christian is not some loose placeholder that can be applied to just any belief. Indeed, the word Christian and the core belief in Jesus are inherently linked. In fact, the word Christian is little more than a short form for the belief that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, was crucified and resurrected. The core belief precedes the word Christian. The word Christian must necessarily then entail the belief in Jesus. And to use Kantian language, the belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, was crucified and resurrected, is analytically entailed in the word Christian. In the same way that the concept of unmarried is analytically entailed in the concept of bachelor, in this same way, the concept that women are equal to men is analytically entailed in the concept of feminism. Feminism is a short form for the belief that women are equal to men. Though you can inject layers of meaning on top of that, you cannot undermine this core belief without bastardizing language itself. As such, if third-wave feminism is meant to represent the core belief that women are superior to men, then it follows it is not feminism any more so than believing in Allah is Christianity. From this it follows that third-wave feminism ought to be renamed to something like female supremacism in order for us not to succumb to linguistic incoherence. In this way, only first and second-wave feminism can be called feminism. Feminism, in turn, can be said to have been replaced by female supremacism. In other words, for the most part, feminism stopped existing with the birth of the third wave. Or more succinctly, feminism only had two waves, and what is referred to as the third wave was not an actual third wave, but something completely new. But if we describe the situation in these terms, then it follows that the anti-feminist community ought to be called the anti-female supremacism community. As the anti-female supremacism community supports all core beliefs of feminism, most importantly the core belief that women are equal to men, they are in themselves not only feminists, but the most active defenders of feminism. They defend a return to feminism and an abandonment of the current female supremacism movement. In fact, there's nothing anti-feminist about the anti-feminist community. None of their core beliefs are anti-feminist. If the ideological rechristening must happen with third-wave feminism, as the anti-feminists assert occurred, then we might as well state that feminism ended with the second wave, and the female supremacism movement began immediately after. So, what we must conclude from this exposition is that the anti-feminist movement ought to be called more appropriately the anti-female supremacism movement. Secondly, anti-female supremacists are ideologically identical to feminists. They are not like feminists, they are feminists. As for anti-feminism proper, only MGTOW seems to reject the feminist core belief that women are equal to men, and as such are the only group I know of that could properly be called anti-feminist without succumbing to an incoherent bastardization of language. Now, I am aware this video can ruffle some feathers. Let me take a moment to note one important distinction between sophistry and philosophy. Within philosophy, we are concerned with statements about the real world. In sophistry, the concern is more with the use of language. My account here speaks to the beliefs held by anti-feminists. I'm not overly concerned with wrapper words like feminism. I don't care whether or not someone calls themselves an anti-feminist because that is what it is cool to be these days. It is not particularly interesting to me to point at someone calling themselves an anti-feminist and troll them by saying they are a feminist. What concerns me is that when we strip away the labels, we are left with sets of beliefs. When we compare the set of beliefs of those who call themselves anti-feminists with those who have historically called themselves feminists, we find there is no meaningful difference. There's one more article of evidence I wish to include just to hammer this point home. Christina Hoff Sommers, who has been referred to by the anti-feminist community as based mom, argues for pretty much the same thing I do in this video. She divides feminism into equity feminism and gender feminism. She supports equity feminism and rejects gender feminism. She is praised in the anti-feminist community. But why would a woman who still calls herself a feminist receive praise from a community that calls itself the anti-feminist community? Well, clearly, because there are no ideological conflicts between feminism and anti-feminism. There only seems to be a conflict between anti-feminists and feminists alike, with a group of people who call themselves feminists but have gone off the ideological rails. The conflict which the anti-feminists find themselves in is not with that of feminism, but with the absence of feminism. As such, the anti-feminist community is identical with the classical feminist movement. Now, let us be more generous with our anti-feminist friends and explore another idea that has from time to time surfaced within their community. The idea I speak of is the notion that it was never the case that the feminist core belief was that women are equal to men, but that the core feminist belief was that women are superior to men. This is a notion that is more commonly heard within the men's rights movement as opposed to anti-feminist circles. Let us suppose that from the very beginning, the feminist core belief has been that women are superior to men. If this is the case, then it would undercut the entirety of the argument I have presented so far. Under such an account, an anti-feminist would be justified in both name and their attempt on refuting the core ideological belief of feminism. However, there's a very big problem with this account. The problem is that there's very little or no actual feminist documentation that could support such a claim. Let me clarify what I mean by this. The language and argumentation within feminist writings always presupposes the assertion that women are equal to men. As such, we must say that feminist theory, as theory, is necessarily constituted on the belief that women are equal to men. However, feminist practice, namely how feminism is lived out by feminist activists, could be argued to have always been driven by the conflicting assertion that women are superior to men. Now, let us recall what we said earlier on. The anti-feminist makes a distinction between feminist ideology and the practitioners of feminism. The anti-feminist makes the further claim that they are attacking the ideology and not the practitioners of feminism, namely, mostly women. As such, the anti-feminist is still bound to attempt a refutation of the theory and not the practice. After all, a condemnation that any particular feminist is doing feminism wrong is no refutation of feminist ideology, but merely a condemnation of a particular practitioner. So, if the anti-feminist wishes to maintain the thesis that feminist ideology is false as theory from the very inception of feminism, as opposed to in practice, he will need to demonstrate that feminist theory from the very early days of Seneca Falls is necessarily predicated on the premise that women are superior to men. As the Declaration of Sentiments makes no such claim, it must be the case that feminist ideology, as theory, according to the anti-feminist, must be true if it defends that women are equal to men. But all practice of feminist ideology is inconsistent with the ideology's theory. But in such a case, the anti-feminist would be saying that feminist ideology is true and condemns the practitioners instead. This seems to run in direct contradiction to the stated anti-feminist mission. In fact, if this were the case, then the anti-feminist movement could be rightly seen as a feminist civil war, or a schism within feminism of sorts. Either way, both accounts place the anti-feminist, or as I've called them, the anti-female supremacist, squarely in the ranks of feminists themselves. Anyways, thanks for listening. Go team.